Thank you very much for having or inviting me here today to talk to you on behalf of E&A. As said, I'm here to talk to you about our Energy Networks Association's role with training and where we see or envisage the future of what the future direction of training for our industry. So I'll probably look at in terms of what's actually happened in the past, what we're doing currently in the moment, and also some of the issues that are actually going to affect the industry going forward and how we probably need to actually be prepared for that into the future. I suppose the first part of it is who is the Energy Networks Association? We are the peak body representing the gas distribution, electricity transmission and distribution businesses across Australia. We have 26 members spread out across Australia and a couple in New Zealand. We look after all of the high voltage, medium and high voltage electricity lines and the distribution gas lines and electricity energy systems associated, and taking it from the generators through to people's doorsteps and industry across Australia. Our members have nearly over $100 billion worth of assets at the moment, and there are currently about 15 million customer connections nationally, which our members actually connect. And our total line length is about 900,000 kilometres across Australia. That's just a diagram of the members we actually currently have across Australia, and they're spread across. So we've got 3 members in Western Australia where we are today. You can also see there's a very good distribution right across the whole of the country and also in New Zealand. E&A itself actually is only quite a new company. We've actually just celebrated our 10th anniversary. We came directly out of an amalgamation between the Australian Gas Association network operators and the Electricity Supply Association's distribution directorate, because there was seen as a gap in the industry for someone that actually looking specifically at the distribution and transmission side of the energy network system. Our key focus is on issues that include national and state government policy and regulation, regulatory environments, and so we are out there advocating on our members' behalf on issues that might be around policy, procedure, technical issues, safety and training. To actually try and meet that requirement, we're actually built into a whole lot of different areas, from policy to regulatory affairs, future networks. But the 2 areas which you guys are probably interested in is the 2 last ones, which is the Asset Management Committee and our Gas Committee. And as part of those, one of our requirements, one of our interests is actually looking after the training requirements for both the gas distribution and the electricity transmission and distribution industry. In terms of our association with EOS, basically since we were actually formed, we've actually had quite a long involvement with EOS, specifically around initially the engagement of E&A in a large number of industry research and development activities, which included the functional analysis of roles and skills required in the energy industry, the training needs and analysis to identify current gaps in skills knowledge within the Australian energy industry organisations, and also to develop strategies to address these training needs, particularly where there were gaps identified, and also to develop national training standards and training solutions. From this, we actually then looked at developing an industry training passport. Initially, EOS had their own technically advisory committee, which was looking at a passport system, but it was ticking along without much momentum across the industry. And E&A also had their own industry skills and training reference group, made up of our own members. And again, we had the same sort of thing, ticking along, trying to move it along, but nothing much was happening for a long period of time. Then the E&A decided to take on the challenge of developing that common passport for the industry, because it was seen as there was some risks associated with non-standardisation across the industry. This was actually accelerated after the Royal Commission to the Victorian bushfires when the Council of Energy Ministers told the industry to develop a common recognition of skills in times of mutual benefit, or they would actually impose that on us themselves. So in 2006, this is just before that, the Energy Networks Association published a network passport guideline. And this document actually became the catalyst to create that National Skills Passport for the electricity supply industry. The objectives of that guideline included encouraging nationally consistent practices in training standards for safe work on electrical networks. To do that, the goal was not just to have a passport, but have an agreement on common standards for the refresher training competencies that are fundamental to our industry and the safety of our network and our assets. The industry decided to work with EOS and incorporate agreed industry definitions in the national training package as a new set of units rather than defining our own industry standards. It was better to see having that independence from us to help us in that aspect. So EOS joined ENA as a guest member, and that gave ENA and our members the benefits of no longer having to maintain our own standards, not at least which was having an independent government regulatory for the accredited training. This led to commence the development of that Australian ESI Skills Passport and the passport and common refresher training practices and processes that we have today. The passport was developed in a collaborative approach by key industry stakeholders, so we engaged not only ourselves and EOS, but we also worked very closely with the unions to actually develop that passport to get something that would actually work for all people. As part of that, we actually developed an MOU across with the unions, with EOS, with ENA, and all of our member constituents as part of that, with the Minister, etc., etc. And this was actually signed off in 2009 to actually develop a passport, or work towards developing a passport to facilitate the electrical distribution networkers, and so they can actually be recognised from state to state or jurisdiction to jurisdiction. This also now facilitates the portability of refresher training competencies by line workers. So initially it was just for usage for emergency situations, but that then changed or grew and evolved into actually looking at the portability of the refresher training and how that refresher training is undertaken and done. In terms of the passport today, the passport was actually launched in October 13, 2010, and since that, the last count, there was over 32,000 passports have been issued to the electricity supply industry. And the passport can either be electronic or paper-based and has several electronic versions which are currently being instigated. One of the companies we've got at the moment is looking at having this as a thing that can actually be on the smartphone, so people can actually have their competencies on their phone at any time. As you can see, you can for each of the doesn't have a no, it doesn't. The whole idea of these is just the fact that it identifies what the competency is, who the date of the training, who did it, and the signature on that. So it basically recognises and it's accredited, and that's stamped off as well. This system has been highly successful for the industry. It has been, it has really helped out, particularly in the cases when there has been some large natural disasters across Australia. It was particularly worked for Cyclone Yahtzee, where interstate workers were able to get out on the ground repairing within a couple of hours of arriving in North Queensland, because the suite of refresher training was recognised throughout, and through the MOU and the passport. It also helped out with the Brisbane floods, and also even over in New Zealand when the Christchurch earthquakes on place, the New Zealanders actually recognised the training and the passport system and our standards because they were very common for utilisation over there as well. Other benefits of the system is in and around, it's nationally it's a standard system which is nationally recognised, and it also gives protection for some of our staff in terms of if there are an incident in a place, the regulators actually recognise this national standard, and this also that it's actually the staff have been actually trained to a specific standard. However, there are still some issues with the passport, and which need to be resolved. One of those is, which come up a couple of times in internal meetings, is EOS still the right place to be developing our common training standards? With discussion with our own members and the members who use the system regularly, yes, it's great to have EOS as a partner in this, to actually provide that recognition and skill set that's independent of the actual industry as well. Unfortunately, there is still an element of apathy since the rollout. Once they rolled it out, a lot of the industries sort of sat back a little bit. They sat on their laurels, and so there's been a little bit of a lowering of engagement between some of our businesses, particularly with some of the other aspects that are going on across the industry at the moment, with privatisation, etc., etc. And there has been our industry group that actually used to meet specifically on this issue no longer meets by itself. It's actually, we've got some members that actually are now part of the EOS board, which do that for us, but some of that engagement has fallen apart. There's also been a slight inconsistency in the uptake of the passport across some of the jurisdictions. Some of our jurisdictions like New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia are very, very strong advocates in this area, and they utilise it quite very, very heavily. However, some of the other jurisdictions don't use it to quite that level, and it's one of ENA's challenges at the moment is to actually encourage our members to promote that with those members to actually to get that full uptake across all of our membership. Other areas that the ENA is currently working on in terms of training, so we don't just sit on just that one thing with the passport, is in 2010 it was recognised that we had other weaknesses in some of the training areas that we're doing, and so we looked at actually developing an environmental competency training guideline and an environmental management handbook. The whole idea of this was actually to develop a training guideline that actually created a framework for member organisations to train the staff in environmental management. It was again the same system on the passport, is that it's a nationally consistent approach to environmental training and offers sustainable environment outcomes for our members. The whole idea was that it's a guide available to training resources that are currently or soon to be available to ENA members, and maps those competencies against that training requirements. And the guideline identifies different responsibility levels depending on the actual activity or job role that the member or staff members have. So if they need like a linesman compared to a substation tech to a comms tech, they all need different levels of requirements, and the whole idea is we mapped those competencies against those requirements. This is just an example of what was done. E2 was just basically for a line worker who does work, and so the whole idea of that, it actually identifies what responsibility that person has, what knowledge would be required for him to actually undertake his job on a day-to-day basis, activities that are actually covered as part of his job, and then the training requirements or identified qualifications that he would probably need to get, and then map those against current qualifications that are out in the available We also then looked at, we actually built an environmental handbook which actually had all the different modules that we actually identified and mapped those responsibilities against the modules within the actual handbook. And the whole idea is, again, going against those responsibilities, mapping what chapters each of those could actually be done. This is actually a copy of the handbook that was actually built to go with the guideline. The whole idea is each of these chapters is a module, and it's basically, we made this as a template as the minimum standard for all of our members to use, and then when a member takes this on, they can then keep that minimum standard, but they can build on it to what they need to or want to, depending on what jurisdiction they're actually in. So then they can make ownership of it, they can actually add their own notes, link it to their own procedures and processes within each of those different jurisdictions, and then train people to that. These are just what's inside some of those issues. So the whole idea is this one's on site and surface water management. The whole idea is it identifies what the issue is, maybe some useful tips in terms of how to actually control water on those sort of areas. It may have some other, this one's on erosion and sediment control, again, background on what the requirement is, and then some useful tips. And then it may actually go into systematic diagrams of what's needed to actually build, and so it's actually got useful tips that they can actually use in the field with them. Again, things like contaminated land. If they come on a site which has got contaminated land, like oil, asbestos, etc., these are identified, and tips. There's also things in there which you can specifically make for your own organisation. The whole idea is we've made those things that if you identify something like a contaminated site, these are the things you must do, like you must identify your supervisor, your safety advisor, and your environmental section straight away. And there might be, that's probably strengthened within with each jurisdiction, so they'll actually map that against their own procedural processes. What I will say with that is that, so back with the handbook, I suppose it's in thanks for the three main organisations that actually helped out with that. One was Ausgrid, particularly Aurora, which is now Tas Networks, or part of Tas Networks, and Transgrid in New South Wales. They were the three main drivers to actually develop that system, and it's now being taken on by most of the other members of our membership. The other thing we're now looking at doing is trying to work out how we can actually turn, because the whole idea of each of these is individual modules. We are looking at actually developing those into accreditation units that we can actually maybe go through EIS or someone else like that to actually deliver these into some of our programs. I know this is not quite the same for this, this group here. However, ENA also has a very strong program with some of the universities out there through our Australian Strategic Technology Program. The ASTP is basically looks at identifying specific engineering or issues from our industry, and actually we then go and work with specific universities right across Australia. We try and share that around to each of the different universities. We actually go around on a quarterly basis to each different jurisdictions to try and talk to the universities in those areas. And the whole idea is for them to come up with different projects for some of their, particularly their engineering staff, to try and keep the knowledge base. One is to solve actual issues, but two is keep the knowledge base with some of the engineering graduates and undergraduate students to try and develop those skills which can then be brought back into the industry for us. And that program has been very, very successful. At the moment we've got projects going with University of New South Wales, University of Sydney, Tasmania, Queensland, and in Monash in South Australia, and also University of South Australia. Now, getting on to the next part. So all that sort of stuff, what's currently going on. However, the next big challenge for us as an industry is going to be around the future. And our industry is rapidly changing. There's been as Danny Kennedy said earlier today, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, is that there's huge pressures on our industry in terms of change with the pressure from renewables coming into the system and how that's actually impacting on the networks, but also how that's going to reshape the whole industry moving forward. We as an industry, we need to actually move with the times and actually try and create what is there going to be our history in this area, or what is going to be our future. If we don't do that, then it'll actually be imposed on us, and some of our businesses may actually fall down or under our current business models. And there's some pressures coming on at the moment. There's a Senate inquiry going on from an issue that came out from Queensland. Other organisations like the the Clean Energy Council have got projects like future-proofing the distribution industry, and they're trying to look at ways from the outside of pushing changes to our industry into our industry. So at E&A, we're actually working at the moment on a project in and around network transformation, and we're working with all of our internal stakeholders, but also some external stakeholders as well, to actually look at transforming our existing business models to match the new requirements. So actually try and change those around to actually meet the requirements into network transformation, and also identify not only the issues around going forward to 250, but also what's the transition, how are we going to get to the networks of the future in 2050, particularly in the next 10 years, which is going to be critical for the industry. 215 to 225, there's going to be a lot of issues of how we move from one business model to the next. As part of this, so with coming on this, we're going to actually be developing, there's going to be moving towards a smart grid. Now, going towards that smart grid, it's going to bring a whole lot of new challenges that we have to, as an industry, actually react to. There's going to be issues like interoperability, cyber security, grid reliability, particularly around the issues about we're going to have a lot more players actually generating and actually moving back into the system. There's going to be issues around system monitoring, control and protection, communications, how we actually interact with our customers through smart meters, through other control systems that are going to be coming in and out, which we will no longer control. Decentralised versus centralised control, customer engagement. We're going to be a lot more interaction with the people and our customers, because people are going to have a lot more, there's going to be a lot more PV and UV out there on individual households. But not just PV, there's also individual, people are bringing in line small wind units, which can actually go on the top of your house. I know customers have got small hydro units on farms and things like that. There's going to be microgrids, battery technology, and all these things are going to come in and actually affect and impact on how we actually do our business. Also to do with capital investment, the users, the utility, and also the access to information versus privacy. There's going to be, as part of that, there's going to be a whole lot of new components or smart grid components that we need to actually take into account when we're actually looking at how we're actually going to transform our business models. And they go, again, through from automatic control standards, power electronics, computer engineering, through to just day-to-day engineering issues and actually site management and maintenance of those areas. So therefore, we need to actually train our staff into the future to actually meet these requirements. It doesn't mean we need to throw out the training we've got at the moment. That's still going to be essential to have that existing training, but we need to augment that system to actually take into account some of the new requirements or issues that are going to come up and beset the industry. Some of the issues or some of the areas that we need to actually look at in terms of potential adding curriculum subjects or enhancements to the current systems are around direct digital control, power system dynamics and stability, power quality and signal analysis, the middleware migration of environmental and policy aspects, particularly around how things are changing with sustainability and a whole of that sort of stuff. Now that goes in and out depending on the government that's in charge at the time, but over time it's going to still get strengthened, and I think we're going to make sure we take more into account as part of that as well. There's also reliability and risk assessment, economic analysis, markets, new concepts, for power system monitoring, protection and control. And particularly some of those areas, we're actually looking at the future-proofing project at the moment with the CEC, and initially they were looking at actually imposing new protection systems which they'd actually put onto the network. And we've gone back to them saying, no, we want to actually take that because that's our bread and butter. We know how to actually work with that, and so we're actually now working with them to come up with new systems and standards around protection, etc., and also to actually try and control that. But then those issues are going to be around, we're going to have to train our staff around those protection issues that need to be done, but they're no longer going to be on our assets, we're actually going to be managing those on somebody else's assets, in somebody's house. And last but not least is communications and IT. Going forward, we need to look at redesigning our existing training or retraining programs that speak directly to the training gaps of existing electricity industry workers. We need to design engineering and technical curricula for future employees that resonate with the needs of the smart grid workforce, such as broad analytical skills, engineering fundamentals, plus also strong business and also community acumen when they actually, because they're going to be directing with the public in a lot more way. Also designing and retraining efforts to familiarise workers with smart grid technology and systems, because technology is going to be continually changing, so we need to make sure our staff are upgraded to move with that technology and systems, and also educate current students who will be the smart grid workforce of tomorrow. In terms of the competencies, we're not saying we need to throw out some of the other competencies. In fact, we identify that we need to keep those, and they're essential to keep those existing skills. However, we're identifying that new training will be essential to understand that new technology, and so we need to add those to the existing training skills development systems to actually train our staff and going forward for the development of that new smart grid. And the issue is going to be that these programs, someone has mentioned about earlier before that there's issues about not changing the systems, because however we're going to have to adapt to actually try and meet these requirements of this very changing and rapidly changing systems. Some of the challenges that we need to overcome is the education and training that needs to keep evolving, including the body of knowledge which is still growing. We need to make sure that applications for using the data are being developed, so we need to make sure that we keep up with that. Programs, practices and standards are still in progress. A lot of issues, particularly around battery storage, there are no or very limited standards that are out there at the moment, and we're trying to catch up with some of those issues at the moment. There's a whole lot of work we're trying to do with Standards Australia at the moment in and around battery storage and maintenance and safety issues in and around some of those areas, let alone things like demand management and a whole lot of other sort of stuff in those sort of spaces. And we're relying on a lot of our members to actually help us out in actually working on a lot of those standards committees to try and bring some of those things up to speed. But we're still in catch-up mode with the rapidly advancing technology. Also, the number of employees actually needing the information is growing as this deployment continues. However, not every engineer and technician needs all of that training. We need to identify for what jobs and what specific things each individual area or group or staff member needs to actually, for him to do his job going into the future. The technical knowledge needs to often be company specific. So the whole idea is having what we said before, a standardised system. However, when you actually take it out to the networks, they then have the ability to actually modify that to actually meet the requirements, because each network, particularly with some of the technology, is completely different, and so you need to make sure some of that is actually matched in, and that's taken into account as part of the training courses. You need for sound, smart grid curricula and materials. But I'll go back to the other thing is that people still need that basic competencies which we actually built through the passport system in the first place, and we still encourage that system is supported and computed in the future. It's just built on. Thank you.
Hey, Rick Dyneham from TAFE New South Wales. One of the considerations, or what are your considerations for RTOs getting into this area of training about getting access to the infrastructure. To get into the training market, it's a very expensive cost,
Yep.
and we really need access to the infrastructure. So how do you see us getting access?
So you're talking about in terms of access to lines or substations to actually undertake that training? I suppose that would be through an agreement with those organisations. That would probably have to be done on a organisational basis. So they'd actually agree with, say it was New South Wales, maybe Networks New South Wales would come up with an agreement with TAFEs New South Wales. I don't know if we could actually do that on the way the system is currently set up on a national basis yet. However, we could actually put together a protocol or a process that could be followed, which could then be utilised on a state-by-state basis. But that, for us, from our perspective, it would be a high-level issue. I don't see it's insurmountable, though.
Bob Taylor from EOS. There seemed to be a common theme, and it was mentioned with Danny's presentation as well, this whole concept of IT skills in the core of our traditional trades.
Yep.
That needs to be addressed. The problem we have is jamming everything into that traditional trade. So you talk about having skills for the network that exists now, and then we've got this IT, then we'll have the sustainability units, and then we'll have handling asbestos units, nothing surer.
Yep.
How do we... There's going to have to be a real review of where the level of these qualifications are at.
And that's why there needs to be a really good mapping of the requirement for each of the individual jobs. What I was trying to say before is that, yes, we need to identify that some of the packages need to be changed quite closely, but not every single staff member in the organisation needs exactly the same training. So it's one of the issues we've got with the asbestos training that the feds are trying to push out at the moment, is that they're talking about all staff need to do that asbestos training. Well, half those staff aren't going to ever be exposed to that asbestos at all, so why would they need to do the full training package? It depends on the job or the application you've got to do. So a line worker would be different to an easement worker compared to a substations tech, to a comms tech. And you need to identify each of those, map the requirements for each of those, and then change your refresher training to actually match that for each of those individual jobs.